questions, but look at the camera when you're like introducing yourself and your position and stuff like that.
That makes sense.
So like name and current position.
Okay, great. So I'm Alex Baumgardner. I am the Master's in Social Work student intern here at the Human Trafficking Commission. I also do contract work with them to provide training and technical assistance. The Human Trafficking Commission is the legislatively charged mandated leader of all anti-human trafficking efforts throughout the state.
What is human trafficking and what is sex trafficking?
So human trafficking is the exploitation of someone through force, fraud, or coercion. And sex trafficking is, of course, like when there is that solely sex solicitation, but there is like crossover between sex and labor. Training stakeholders is really big. I think awareness is huge. People don't really realize that it's a hidden crime because it's all around you and you just maybe don't recognize it. I think sometimes people think of like Taken, the movie, and so they think, well, if somebody's not, in chains or reaching out for help, then I must not be seeing it, but it's so much more subtle than that. And so, and people, things like trauma bonds and Stockholm syndrome is like what keep people potentially like going out and about and then like still being in their trafficking situation. And so really training on like breaking those misconceptions and myths is really important. So training people on not only like how to spot it and within their perspective, profession or just within their community, but also how to respond to it if, from a community level, but then also of course from a service provision level for law enforcement, for first responders in general, and healthcare and things like that.
Nicole Sullivan, I'm Director of Reentry Services for Juvenile Justice with the Department of Public Safety. Previously, I've worked with adult correction and as Deputy Secretary over policy planning and programming. I had an opportunity to work on a human trafficking project that looked at the intersection between corrections and the human trafficking issue. There are different forms of human trafficking, but I think we think about it a lot related to, kind of sex trafficking. Because of that, and because of the impact that and the trauma that brings, you then tend to see or can see that some of those women end up committing crimes or being involved in crimes because of that experience. And then when they come into incarceration, the correctional system is more focused on, just the behaviors we're seeing and addressing those and not really looking at some of the underlying causes. And I don't think that the system names that underlying cause as sex trafficking or that trauma. There may have been substance abuse, there may have been other types of abuse, but not putting it all together in that kind of context is something that is not really recognized. The project we worked on was trying to begin to scratch the surface on that and see what that intersection is, and if there are things that should be done after a woman is incarcerated that would better address some of those underlying issues. And so a big part of the research was, let's just find out what's out there. So they did that lit review. They wanted to talk to other correctional folks to kind of figure out what they were seeing. So there was an opportunity to do a national survey of all correctional administrators across the country. Just an opportunity to ask them, are you seeing these things? What are you seeing? Are you doing anything? Are you doing training? Ultimately, where we wanted to go was to begin building kind of a screening assessment that could be used at intake to kind of identify whether or not what we're seeing in this individual's background is related to human trafficking, and therefore would that lend itself to specific types of programs or services that individual should receive, when they come into the criminal justice system.
I'm Kate Diademo. I use they and she pronouns, and I'm a partner at Reframe Health and Justice. We're a queer people of color collective, Asian and Latina, that work at the intersection of harm reduction, healing justice, and systems change.
Could you explain what terms you use regarding trafficking and why?
Yeah. So in legal code, both federal and on the state level, there's a delineation between sex trafficking and labor trafficking. And I don't subscribe to that, so I'm not going to use that term. I'm generally going to use human trafficking, trafficking in persons, or trafficking, and you'll know that I don't mean arms. And the reason for that is because the history of that was actually a really political decision. It didn't come from any kind of understanding of the sex trade as different from other forms of labor, but in the initial debates about how to write a trafficking law, there was a lot of people who really wanted to say that everyone in the sex trade was being exploited and experiencing trafficking, and create a false delineation to say that there is no consensual form of sexual labor. And so the compromise was that there was the compromise for people who wanted to say all sex work was trafficking, was that they created these kind of two different spheres. But for the most part, I don't use that term because sex work is work. And it really creates a hierarchy of harm. If we're talking about trafficking and exploitation, we really need to understand that all these other forms experience incredible violence, don't need to sit on a hierarchy of trauma, and we're not actually giving them as much attention because of that delineation. And I find that really just disrespectful. The work around those issues in FOSTA SESTA in particular are really highlighting a broader issue, which is what a lot of spaces call digital gentrification. And very similar to other forms of gentrification, people occupy space. And when folks with more social capital, more economic capital desire that space, what's really important is to remove undesirable people from that space, to clean it up. And on the internet, that's being done with content moderation. And so what happens when people lose access to the places that they are is that it not only it disrupts lives. And for sex workers, being on the internet has opened a lot of opportunities, especially for harm reduction and self-protection and self-reliance. And so when people wanted to work for themselves, move out of public space, getting online was really important. It allowed people to screen clients. It allowed people to set up where they wanted to go and negotiate for their boundaries without being directly in front of that person. People moved online because it was safer, because it was better. And so what FOSTA SESTA did was expand both civil liability for companies and criminal liabilities for companies and the people that use those services. FOSTA SESTA took that approach where it said, if you are on the internet and on a website, or run a website or a platform where people post and use that, we're going to create a very poorly worded, and when I say poorly worded in law, I mean very opaque, because it said you were knowingly facilitating trafficking. And that sounds in vernacular like it's really clear, but facilitation is actually a very low standard. And there was no way to kind of know what that looked like. And civil liability means that people can sue. And they also gave attorneys generals across the country standing, which means the ability to sue, if they thought that this was an issue in their state. The other thing that it did was open up criminal liability. So it said also, if you knowingly facilitate prostitution, so not trafficking, but if you have an inclination that there's people trading sex on your site, you're now criminally liable as well. And so what happened was sex workers in the spaces that they were kicked off and had to immediately figure out where their clients were, how to attract new clients. And that is a very precarious place. The criminalization of the sex industry also directly targets sex workers themselves working together and sharing information. Biggest thing, if I can convey, it is that we need to be talking about state violence and the state violence of criminalization and poverty, and the ways that we marginalize people as a society. And that is actually how we're going to address trafficking. If we're just doing kind of the cherry picking of an individual person at the end, then we actually don't care about preventing it, most certainly, but we're actually never going to end it.